There is a certain kind of person. You may know them, you may be them. They are the ones who, when the world around them fractures, when the diagnosis comes, when the relationship ends, when the silence in the house becomes unbearable, they do not call anyone. They do not cry in public. They do not post a fragile confession into the glowing void of social media. They simply sit with it. They make a cup of tea, or they go for a long walk at an hour when no one else is awake. They open a notebook and write in the dark. They solve, they plan, they carry, and to the outside world, they look fine. They look more than fine. They look capable, impossibly, almost painfully capable. But there is something underneath that capability, something that has never been named, something that this video exists to name. Because here is the brutal truth. The person who always figures it out alone is not just independent. They are not simply strong. There is an entire architecture of the heart hidden beneath that self-sufficiency, a sacred and silent structure built, brick by brick, from every moment someone was not there when they needed them most. And that architecture, as beautiful and as functional as it is costing them something they cannot afford to keep paying. We are going to talk about that cost today, not to wound, not to pathologize, but to see. To truly compassionately see, perhaps for the first time. To understand the adult who disappears into self-reliance, we have to go back. Not far back, just far enough. Somewhere. In a childhood, in a family, in a classroom, or in a single defining season of early life. This person learned something. Not in words. Words were never used. It was learned the way children learn the most important things. Through pattern, through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of experience. They learned that needing people is dangerous. Perhaps they reached for a parent and the parent was distracted. Perhaps they reached again and were told not to be so sensitive. Perhaps they needed comfort during a storm and were handed logic instead. Perhaps there was no storm at all. Just a slow, grey absence. A house full of people and the peculiar loneliness of never being truly witnessed. Carl Jung spoke of this. Of the shadow self. The parts of us that we learn to hide, not because they are ugly, but because we were taught they were unwelcome. The need for comfort becomes a shadow. The desire to be held becomes a shadow. The simple, human hunger to say, I am not okay, and have someone stay, that becomes buried so deep that eventually the person themselves can no longer find it. This is what psychologists call the internalized neglect schema. It is not dramatic. It does not require abuse. It requires only this, a consistent enough message, received early enough, that vulnerability leads to disappointment. And so the child adapts. Because children are the most extraordinary adapters in the universe. They stop reaching. They start solving. They build a self that does not need. They become, in the language of neuroscience, hypervigilant to their own nervous system. The amygdala, that ancient almond-shaped structure at the center of the brain's emotional processing, learns to fire a warning before vulnerability can even surface. Not safe. Handle it yourself. Do not let them see. Over time, this is not a choice. It becomes a reflex, a way of being so automatic that it feels like identity. And in many ways, it is identity. It has become the self. The person who always figures it out alone does not experience self-sufficiency as a strategy. They experience it as who they are. That is the first thing we must understand with tenderness rather than judgment. Now, the cost. We speak so readily of the gifts of self-reliance, and they are real. The person who figures it out alone is often extraordinary. Creative in crisis, calm under pressure, architecturally brilliant at solving problems that would collapse others. They have developed, through necessity, a kind of interior resilience that is genuinely remarkable. But gifts forged in the fire of survival carry the shape of the wound that created them. Here is what this way of living costs, quietly, steadily, over years. The first cost is intimacy, real intimacy, the kind that heals, the kind that neurologically regulates the nervous system, the kind that makes us feel less alone on this particular planet, requires vulnerability. It requires showing the unfinished version, the confused version, the I do not know what I'm doing version. The person who always figures it out alone rarely shows that version, not because they are dishonest, but because showing it feels, at a somatic level, in the body, like stepping off a cliff. The neural pathways built in childhood root away from exposure before consciousness even intervenes. And so their relationships, though often warm and loyal, tend to remain at a certain depth. People love them, people rely on them, but they are rarely the person that someone else gets to save. They are rarely the one being held, and over time, quietly, in the way that hunger becomes numbness. They stop expecting to be. The second cost is exhaustion. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has no name in most languages. It is not the tiredness of having done too much. It is the tiredness of having carried everything alone for so long that you have forgotten what it felt like to put something down. Psychologists who study this describe it as chronic hyperactivation of the stress response, the body living in a perpetual low-grade state of emergency management. The cortisol is never fully metabolized. The shoulders never fully drop. Even rest does not fully restore, because rest requires the nervous system to believe, at a cellular level, that it is safe to stop being on guard. For the person who always figures it out alone, that belief is often structurally unavailable. They are tired in a way they cannot explain, and because they cannot explain it, they do not mention it. And because they do not mention it, nothing changes. The third cost, and perhaps the most invisible, is self-knowledge. Here is the paradox. The person who is most accustomed to living inside their own head is often, in certain crucial ways, the least connected to their inner world. Because metacognition, the capacity to observe one's own thinking and feeling from a compassionate distance, requires stillness. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately solving it. And the person who always figures it out alone has built their entire architecture on solving. Feeling becomes a problem to be processed. Sadness becomes a project, grief becomes a task, and somewhere in all that efficient internal management, the actual felt experience of being alive, the raw, unedited, sometimes beautiful, sometimes agonizing texture of a life, gets filed away, unwitnessed, even by themselves. This is the invisible grief that no one speaks of. Not the grief of loss, the grief of a life not fully inhabited. There is a metaphor worth sitting with. The ocean does not resist its waves. It does not solve them, organize them, or process them into stillness. It simply holds them. It is large enough to contain them. And when they break, they return. They are not lost. They become the ocean again. This is what the psychologists and the philosophers and the contemplatives throughout history have been gesturing toward when they speak of emotional integration. Not the elimination of difficulty, not the management of pain, but the expansion of the self, the interior self, to be large enough to hold experience without being destroyed by it. Viktor Frankl, writing from the incomprehensible darkness of a concentration camp, spoke of the space between stimulus and response, that sacred pause, that breath, that moment of metacognitive awareness, as the location of human freedom. Not freedom from pain, freedom within it. For the person who always figures it out alone, the invitation, and it is an invitation, not a demand, is to begin practicing that pause. Not to stop solving, but to notice, before the solving begins, what is actually present. What am I feeling right now? What do I need to do about this feeling? Just, what is here? This practice, deceptively simple, is one of the most radical acts available to the self-sufficient person, because it interrupts the reflex. It creates a hairline fracture in the architecture, not to destroy it, but to let in light. Neurologically, this is not metaphor. Research into interoception, the brain's capacity to perceive the internal state of the body, suggests that people who regularly pause to name their emotional experience show measurably different activity in the prefrontal cortex. The naming itself creates distance. The distance creates choice. To say, I am tired and I do not want to carry this alone right now, is not weakness. It is a sophisticated act of neural rewiring. It is, in the truest sense, alchemy. If you have recognized yourself in any of this, if something in this conversation has landed with that particular resonance of the true thing heard at last, then there is something important to say to you directly. You are not broken. The patterns you have built are not flaws. They are not evidence of damage or dysfunction. They are evidence of extraordinary intelligence. The intelligence of a being who found a way to survive circumstances that required more than a child should ever have had to provide for themselves. The architecture of self-sufficiency was not a mistake. It was a masterpiece of adaptation, but you are not a child anymore. And the house you built to survive the storm has become, without your noticing, the thing that is keeping out the light. Jung called this process the slow, often uncomfortable work of bringing the hidden self into conscious relationship with the known self. Individuation. It is not a destination. It is not a state you arrive at and remain in forever. It is a direction. A continuous, imperfect, profoundly human orientation toward wholeness. It begins not with grand gestures, but with small ones. It begins with telling one person one true thing about how you are actually doing. Not the curated version, not the I'm fine, just busy version, but the real version. Even if your voice shakes, even if it feels like too much, even if you cannot finish the sentence, it begins with asking for help with something small. Not because you cannot handle it, but as practice. As a message sent deliberately to the nervous system, it is safe to need. It is safe to receive. It begins with sitting for 5 minutes without solving anything, without reaching for the phone or the notebook or the next task, just sitting with whatever is present, allowing the wave, trusting the ocean. It begins, and this may be the most difficult of all, with practicing self-compassion, not as a concept, but as a physical act. Psychologist Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion consistently shows that the inner voice of the self-sufficient person tends to be the harshest voice in any room they inhabit. They would never speak to a friend the way they speak to themselves. Begin speaking to yourself the way you would speak to someone you love who is carrying what you carry. This is not indulgence. This is not softness. This is the bravest thing the self-sufficient person can do, because it requires dismantling, or rather, gently, tenderly expanding, the very identity that has kept them safe. That is not a small thing. It is an enormous thing. It deserves to be honored. We live in a culture that romanticizes self-sufficiency, that builds statues to those who need no one. That tells us, in 1,000 quiet ways, that to be independent is to have arrived at maturity, at strength, at some elevated state of personhood. But the deepest wisdom traditions of the human story have always known something different. The Stoics knew it. The Buddhist teachers knew it. The modern neuroscientists, with their data on co-regulation and secure attachment, know it in a different language, but toward the same truth. We are not made to be islands. The nervous system does not fully regulate in isolation. The self does not fully know itself without the mirror of genuine relationship. The deepest healing does not happen in the private notebook or the long solo walk. Though those have their place, their beauty, their necessity, the deepest healing happens in the moment of being seen, not performed, not managed, not presented, seen. And the extraordinary, perhaps surprising gift available to the person who has always figured it out alone, the gift that their very architecture of strength has prepared them for, is this. When they finally allow themselves to be seen, when they finally lower the sophisticated, beautiful, exhausting armor, even partially, even briefly, what emerges is not weakness. What emerges is someone who has survived extraordinary things, who has developed extraordinary depth, who has learned, in the wilderness of their own interiority, things about the nature of endurance and meaning and the quiet resilience of the human spirit that most people spend a lifetime looking for. They are not less for having needed no one, but they will be more whole, more free, more truly themselves, for allowing at last for someone to stay. You do not have to figure this out alone, for perhaps the first time. You do not have to figure this out alone. Peace is not the absence of struggle. It is the willingness to stop struggling alone. Thank you for being here. Here is something nobody talks about. This person does fall in love, deeply sometimes, with a ferocity that surprises even them, because they spent so long believing they did not need anyone that when someone finally gets through, the feeling is almost violent in its intensity. It catches them off guard every time. They had built such a convincing case for their own self-sufficiency that love, when it arrives, feels almost like an ambush. But loving someone does not undo the architecture. It only reveals it. They love with one hand extended and one hand held back. They are present and absent at once, sometimes in the same sentence, sometimes in the same breath. They will drive across the city at midnight for the person they love. They will remember the name of their partner's childhood dog, the exact shade of anxiety in their voice before a difficult conversation, the way they take their coffee on mornings when the world feels heavy. They show up. In every practical, tangible, measurable way, they show up. And then, when that same person tries to reach the soft interior, when they ask, "But how are you doing really?" they will feel a door close, quietly, without explanation, without hostility, just a gentle, almost imperceptible withdrawal, so practiced it barely registers as a choice. Their partner feels it, a warmth with a wall behind it, an intimacy that goes to a certain depth and then stops, like a hallway that ends without warning. The terrible irony is this. The person who always figures it out alone almost always chooses partners who need them. not consciously, not cynically, but the pull is real and the reason is old. Being needed is familiar. Being needed means they have a role, a function, a reason to stay that does not require them to be vulnerable, only capable. When the other person is struggling, they know exactly what to do. They become calm, resourceful, present in the most grounded sense of the word. Crisis, paradoxically, is where they feel most at home. Because in crisis, no one asks them how they feel. Everyone just needs them to function. But love, real love, the sustained, ordinary, undramatic love of two people simply living alongside each other, does not always provide that structure. Sometimes it just sits there, quiet and open, asking nothing except, be here, be known, let me see you. And that is the hardest thing they have ever been asked to do. The moment love requires them to receive, to be seen struggling, to admit they are lost, to say, I need you right now, without immediately adding, but I'm fine, don't worry. Something in the system short circuits. The words exist somewhere inside them. They can feel them, distantly, like a sound heard through walls. But the distance between feeling and speaking for this person can be enormous. A canyon crossed only with great effort, and usually in private. So the words come out clipped, practical, stripped of the feeling underneath, or they do not come out at all. They are not cold. They are not incapable of depth. They are, in fact, some of the most intensely feeling people alive, which is precisely why the armor exists. You do not build walls around emptiness. You build them around something worth protecting. The tragedy is not that they cannot love. The tragedy is that the love they carry, vast, loyal, fierce, patient, is so rarely fully given. Not because they withhold it deliberately, but because the final step, the step that requires them to be held rather than to hold, is the one the nervous system refuses to take without a fight. There is also this. The self-sufficient person in love often becomes, quietly, exhausted by the asymmetry. They give, they support, they hold the other person's pain with tenderness and competence, and then they go home, or to the other side of the bed, and hold their own pain alone, the way they have always held it. Because asking feels like too much. Because they do not want to be a burden. Because somewhere, in the foundational wiring of who they are, they still believe, despite all evidence, despite the love they can plainly see, that if they show the full weight of what they carry, the other person will leave. This is the wound speaking, not the truth. The work is not to love more. They already love more than most people will ever know. The reservoir is not the problem. The work is to let love land, to stay in the room when someone tries to take care of them instead of deflecting it into a joke or a practical task, to receive a compliment without immediately minimizing it, to answer, how are you with something true, even when the true thing is uncomfortable, even when it makes them feel exposed in a way that every instinct screams to correct, to say just once without softening it, without the footnote, without the immediate reassurance, I am struggling, and I need you, not because they cannot handle it alone. They can, they always have, but because handling it alone, every time, for the rest of a life, is not strength. It is just a very old habit that was never given permission to change. 3 sentences, a lifetime of practice, and the possibility, small, real, worth everything, of finally being known.